Well, welcome to each of you to coming into this space for this Action for the Holy Land and some really important conversations about what's happening on the other side of the world. And we are grateful that you're here and holding space for this conversation. I'm Reverend Mandy North. I'm the pastor here at the Manassas Church of the Brethren, and it's just a great opportunity to have you together. I did want to spend a minute just introducing our panelists. We have Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon, and she's the executive director of the Churches for Middle East Peace. She's also an ordained pastor in the Evangelical Covenant Church. And then we have Reverend Dr. Nathan Hosler, and he's the director of the Office of Peacebuilding and the Policy for the Church of the Brethren, and he serves on the board for the Churches of Middle East Peace. So welcome to each of you as well, and I'm going to turn it over to Nate.
Thank you, Mandy, and thanks all for coming out. Thanks, May, for coming out. As noted, I'm Nate Hosler, and I work for the Church of the Brethren, one of the members of Churches for Middle East Peace, which is a coalition. I think we're at 38. I feel like I should know this. Upper 30s national church religious bodies that serve in this coalition that has been around for just over 40 years or just on 40 years. My work is in the policy space, but I'm also a pastor at a congregation on Capitol Hill for the Church of the Brethren. And so I'm going to frame this conversation just a little bit and then have a chunk of time for May to speak specifically around CMEP's work, as well as our recent mini delegation to the Middle East, as well as some ways to get engaged. And then I'll come back up and we'll try to leave a fair amount of time for conversation and discussion, since this is, of course, a topic that often generates much conversation. Churches Middle East Peace has a number of policy priorities, which I'll let May maybe talk through a bit. May and I were in, she was a little more than I was, but we were in Israel and Palestine in the end of May. I don't have the exact date to my mind, but I know it was the end of May because I missed my 18th anniversary to be there and got the blessing of my wife, who's also a pastor and also very engaged in this work. We were able to travel and meet with church partners. There's institutional partners. For example, we met with Catholic Relief Services. We met with a number of rabbis, a number of Palestinian Christians, priests, Greek Patriarch of Jerusalem. We're able to hear of the ongoing struggle. This is, of course, not a new struggle, but particularly around the issue of what's happening since October 7th and in Gaza. Towards the end of the trip, after visiting the Christ at the Checkpoint Conference of Palestinian Christians in Bethlehem, we're able to go to the Gaza envelope, able to look into Gaza from Sderot, as well as visit with some kibbutz, specifically with a member of a kibbutz that was attacked on October 7th, and hear both the stories of that experience as well as the ongoing struggle that is happening. For example, when we were in Bethlehem, it was, and this is often not in the news as much, there are continually families leaving, families who have been there for generations, who are historic Christian families there. And the Church of the Brethren, we have many policies that address both our spiritual and theological commitments. One that we have specifically that came out of a conversation at a Churches Middle East Peace board meeting in, I think, 2015 with an Armenian Orthodox church was his specific concern and urgent concern around the diminishing presence of Christians in the Holy Land. And while, of course, we're involved with and concerned about all peoples, people that are part of our own faith tradition feel particularly close, and this was something that we heard again and again from Palestinian Christians of both the devastation, what's happening in Gaza, as well as the ongoing strain they're feeling, and particularly in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and how that is meaning that many families are, even though they've been there for generations and are committed to staying and working for peace, are leaving because it's just too difficult. I will maybe turn over to May now to talk a bit more about the trip and CMEP's work, and then as noted, we'll have a fair amount of time to discuss. Part of this was talking about how we've engaged as CMEP, but also in the local context. Obviously, not everyone works directly in relation with an organization like CMEP, but there are many ways to get directly engaged. One way that in the Washington, D.C. context that my wife particularly has been very involved is we have a close ongoing connection with Hil Havra, which is a Jewish congregation on Capitol Hill. We've hosted there for years, had their Hebrew school in our church on Sunday mornings, which was a blessing and also logistically sometimes complicated. But we had a long relationship. So coming out of that and some work around receiving asylum seekers that have been bused to DC, we were asked to participate, or she was asked particularly to participate in what was called a Shabbat table was an empty Shabbat table on the mall. And she would go, and this was to mark the hostages that were taken. And so even though she was engaged in very active, continues to be active in direct protests, working for ceasefire, she also was working very closely with the Jewish congregation in our immediate neighborhood and being a pastoral presence and raising up, as CMEP has for a long time. We are concerned of both release of hostages and political detainees, as well as the ongoing war and violence. So with that, I'll turn over to May.
Thank you, Nate. Thanks for coming out tonight. It's a privilege to have some time with you and to have the opportunity to talk about an issue and what's happening right now in Israel and in Gaza and in the occupied Palestinian territories. Today is day 281 since October 7th. I know that because every single day I've been giving a video update of what's happened in the last 24 hours. And I can tell you what happened in the last 24 hours if that's one of the questions that you have when we get to the point of discussion. And it's hard in, 15, 20 minutes to summarize. How do we even talk about this moment? How do we even talk about October 7th? Many people say, well, it didn't start with October 7th. And it's true, things didn't start on October 7th, but October 7th was a critical day and a horrific day. And we have to acknowledge the horrors that happened that day. And so I thank you for coming. And my hope and prayer, and Dominic's with me, who's been working with us at Churches for Middle East Peace, and we said a prayer together on our way here. And I was praying peace upon us in our hearts and in our souls, and peace physically to the land of Israel and to the Palestinian territories. Because even the conversation that we're having, there's so much that's provocative. And I promise you, we're not going to cover it all. I have 3 master's degrees and 2 doctorates. I'm considered an expert on this issue. And I say that one of the things that I've learned since October 7th is that I don't know much. And I've received probably more awards since October 7th than I have in my adult life, and I've never failed more miserably at my work. And so where are we today? And I was asked to tell some stories about our trip, and so I wanted to tell you some specific stories. And before I do, I want to just talk about the posture that I hope we might have in hearing these stories. One of the prayers that I have been praying regularly, I learned in a position that I had previously. I used to work for World Vision. How many of you know it or have heard of it? It's an international development organization. The founder of World Vision used to pray the prayer, "Break my heart for the things that break the heart of God." And after October 7th, I started to pray that prayer. And very, very quickly, I had to start to pray a second prayer because there was so much horror and so much trauma and so much death and so much violence and so much displacement and so much more death. I mean, this morning alone, there was another incident in Gaza where at least 70 people were killed. That was just today. The death toll is approaching 40,000 people. That's not talking about the 240 people that were taken hostage on October 7th, of which there's about 100 or so that remain in Gaza, and they think that maybe only 30 to 50 of them are still alive. I mean, I haven't even started talking about the statistics. And so when we say break our heart for the things that break the heart of God, my heart is not big enough. So my second prayer has been, then God, expand my heart. Make my heart bigger, that we would allow our hearts to be broken. And the other hope that I have is that we would not close our eyes to the realities of what's happening. Even today, 281 days later, we're not seeing Gaza in the news. We're not seeing it. We're not seeing news about hostages. We're not seeing news about what's happening in the West Bank. The death toll in the West Bank since October 7th is now more than 250 people killed by settlers and the Israeli military in the West Bank, right? And we don't hear about these things. And so the posture that I'm asking for is that we would come with a posture of learning and a posture of allowing our hearts to be broken, regardless of what geopolitical perspective we're coming from, what side of the aisle we're on, but that we would come with that posture. And so I wanted to tell you just a few stories, and then we'll have some time for questions. One of the stories I wanted to tell you about is a story, and I'll start with this just because Nate had mentioned it, that we spent some time on the Gaza envelope. The Gaza envelope is the part within Israel proper that's near the Negev desert. It's where the kibbutzim are located. It's where many of the populations of the kibbutzim are located that experienced some of the worst atrocities on October 7th. And we spent a day there, and we spent time at the Nova Music Festival location. And if you're not familiar with what that was, it was where a massacre occurred on October 7th. The death toll that day was more than 350 people killed at that site. And we went there to give witness to the atrocities that happened. And I think it's critical. There are people that are a part of the Palestinian activist movement that think that acknowledging the atrocities that happened on October 7th somehow minimize your activism for Palestinian liberation and justice. And I actually believe it empowers. When we're advocating for justice, how can we ignore any injustice that's happening anywhere? What happened on October 7th was atrocious. And it was a crime against not only the individuals who were killed that day, but a crime against God. And we have to acknowledge that. And one of the commitments that I made after October 7th, and this again speaks to my own weakness, because it was one of the most difficult things that I've had to do, was that I watched the videos that were compiled of the atrocities that day. I felt like I needed to do so in order, how can I be a faithful witness to calling for reconciliation and justice between Israelis and Palestinians if I'm not willing myself to give witness to what happened on that day? And so there are videos that were taken from security cameras, that were taken from militants that were actively involved in the killing, that actually show the massacre as it was happening at the Nova Music Festival, that show people being killed in the kibbutzim. And I felt like I needed to give witness to that in solidarity with Jewish people that I know and love, and to seek to understand the horrors of that day and what that has meant for Jewish people in Israel and around the world. So we also spent time that day meeting with a woman that lives in one of the kibbutzim. And I won't tell you the specific one or this woman's name, but I want to tell you just a little bit about what she described. Her father was there that day on October 7th, and he had to be rescued 7 different times from Hamas militants that came into the kibbutz, because there was so much chaos, and the community members that were present who were supposed to protect the community were all killed. It was the first thing that happened. And so he was out in a field initially, and one of the community members who was a part of the protection, went and got him and brought him back to his home. Well, then his home was one of the first homes that was infiltrated. And so then he had to be rescued from his home. And then once he was rescued, and it went like that 7 times. Now, her father lived, and she ended up moving back to the kibbutz. She was out of the country when that happened. But I'll tell you what was so powerful. We were standing in this space, and she's telling this story, and she knows many of the people who lost their lives that day, and we could see buildings that had been blown up. One of the things that happened that day was that the gas tanks in the homes of the kibbutz, in the homes there, were often outside of the homes, and so many of them were actually lit on fire and then thrown into the homes so that people would leave and then could be killed. And so we saw all of this. We actually had an incident where mortar fire came in and we had to take cover, and I got intimately connected with Nate's right thigh. I haven't talked to his wife about that yet, but in the midst of, the ongoing fear, and I don't even have words for what we witnessed, and this is 9 months later. This Jewish Israeli woman takes us right to the border, because this kibbutz happens to be right next to the Gaza border. And she says, I thought this was so profound that these were her last words to us when we left. She said, everything within me makes me feel like I should hate Palestinians. And she said, but I don't hate Palestinians. And she said, I know that we will never have peace until they have peace. And we will never have peace until they are free. And after all of this, we're standing next to posters of where there are still people from this kibbutz held in Gaza. This woman has the courage to say, I know that I will not be free until these people are free. I thought that took so much courage for this Jewish Israeli woman to say so. So that's one story I wanted to share with you. I wanted to share the story with you of one of my best friends who's a Palestinian Christian woman. Her name is Shireen. She teaches at Bethlehem Bible College. Have you ever heard of her? Have you heard of Bethlehem Bible College? Yes, it's in Bethlehem. You've heard of that. She's a teacher there. Shireen is one of the most loving women I know. She's a Palestinian Christian. The percentage of Palestinian Christians in the West Bank is less than 1%. And she has family members in Gaza. And I will never forget the day that she called me, and she was just weeping. And she and I cried together because she lost 2 of her aunts when there was a bombing that was in a home that was next to the St. Porphyrius Church in Gaza. And one of the annexes of the church was blown up when the home was targeted, and 18 people were killed in the bombing of the St. Porphyrius Church in Gaza, 18 Christians. So when we talk about a death toll of 35,000, almost 40,000 people, some of those are Christians in Gaza. And Shireen was telling me the story of her 2 aunts being killed. One of them was killed because she was under the rubble. There was no light because after October 7th, the Israeli government had a policy of no food, no water, no gas, no electricity. That was the policy. And it was until all hostages are returned home. And so there was no electricity to have light to be able to search for people under the rubble. So after the church was bombed, people who were alive had to stay under the rubble until morning came and there was light so that the rubble could actually be moved. So when Shireen's aunt, she was actually rescued. She was alive when she came out of the rubble, but she had had so much internal bleeding that she ended up bleeding to death the next day. And then, I don't know how many weeks later it was, but I got another call from Shireen. And we ended up weeping together on the phone once again because her uncle was killed. He had had a medical incident. He was at the Latin Family Church, which is the other church in Gaza. And he was trying to get to the hospital. And at that time, the Israeli military was doing, it had an incursion. It was doing, it was present, and so no one could leave to actually get to the hospital, and he had to because he was going to die because his medical condition was so severe, and when he sought to get to the hospital, he was shot and killed by the Israeli military. So she's lost 3, 2 of her aunts and her uncle, just in the last 9 months. And then I want to tell you about some of my friends at Gaza. I've had the privilege of going to Gaza. Have any of you been to Gaza before? The first time I went, you did? Wow. The first time I went to Gaza, it was, I was so surprised by how beautiful it is. If you didn't know where you are, you might think that you're on the Mediterranean in Italy, minus the thousands and thousands of tons of waste that are being dumped into the Mediterranean, minus the fact that you don't have electricity, minus the fact that you have, and this was, the last time I was there was May of 2022. I was supposed to go in fall of 2023. I normally go in about once a year. One of the things in Gaza that you have constantly is you have drones. And so in Gaza, you always hear the sound of zzz, and sometimes it's louder when the drones are low, and then when they're high up, you hear it less. And so all those things make you know that you're not, on a Mediterranean coastal town, but it's beautiful. It's on the, it's on the Mediterranean Sea. It's beautiful. And so when I was last in Gaza in May 2022, I had dinner with the family. And the family last name is Abu Noor. Nasr Abu Noor is the head of this family. He's a devout Muslim who actually has more than one wife. And he would tease me that I'm away from my husband too much. So he would say, give me your husband's phone number because he needs to take a second wife because you don't spend enough time with him. That's what he would say. He was the head of nursing at the Islamic University in Gaza. And we got to know him at Churches for Middle East Peace because his daughter, she was, I think, 11 when we met her. His daughter had cancer, and she could not get permits to get into Israel to be able to get treatment for cancer. And there's no cancer treatment in Gaza. And so we worked through the American government to be able to help get Israeli permits for his daughter to be able to travel to Jerusalem to be able to get treatments for her cancer. It's one of the, I used to say, like, if I've done nothing, this was like one of the things that we accomplished, helping get this little girl treatment. I was devastated. She ended up dying about 9 months after she started receiving cancer treatment. But I had the opportunity to meet her, and he wanted to host us for dinner, and so I had dinner at his home May of 2022. And his family was so incredibly hospitable. You know, this Muslim family, I don't know if any of you have ever spent any time in the Middle East or in an Arab family. You can't walk into the door without having coffee, and then after coffee you have juice, and then after you have juice you have water, and then you have coffee again, and then you have chocolate, and then you have cookies. So the expression in Arabic, you know, hutti, 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 it's like put more on your plate, put more on your plate, or kuli, 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 eat more. I weighed like 40 more pounds when I lived in the Middle East because the Arab women are always making you eat more, right? Like, hutti, eat more on your plate. And so we had this lovely meal, and the family was just wonderful, wonderful. So he led the head of nursing. He was the head of nursing at the Islamic University in Gaza. And I got a note at the end of February that he was killed in an Israeli bombing. And so I remember after his daughter died, I sent him a note and just sent condolences about how we were so grieved at his loss. And he wrote back the kindest, most beautiful response, and he said an expression in Arabic, and he said, well, at least she's alongside God and with God in heaven. And I just thought of his death when we heard that news, that it was so heartbreaking. And he is one of now approaching 40,000 who've been killed in the last 9+ months. So I wanted to tell you those stories of just three. Those are just three people. Of how many more stories could we tell? And there's many, many things we could talk about. I'll close just by saying, what's our role at Churches for Middle East Peace? We say educate, elevate, advocate. We want to educate about realities of what's happening in the Middle East. We want to elevate the voices of those that are committed to peace in a multi-narrative way while not compromising on issues of human rights and justice. And we want to advocate. We want to advocate for U.S. policies that promote peace and not war. So our policy positions, we have 12 policy positions that broadly address all of our work, which is not only focused on Israel-Palestine, it focuses on the whole Middle East, but our policy positions specifically in response to Gaza are that we've been calling for a comprehensive and permanent ceasefire since October 7th. And honestly, when we had our first meeting with the White House about that, they mocked us. They mocked us. And now they're saying, the White House now is saying, we've been saying that since October. And we're like, no, you really have not. But that's our first call. Our second call is for immediate and adequate humanitarian assistance into Gaza. I have not even begun to talk to you about the humanitarian crisis there. Gaza was de-developing before October 7th. 99+% of the water was not potable before October 7th. There was a blockade that existed upon Gaza for 16+ years before October 7th. The average amount of food and supplies that were needed to get into Gaza before October 7th were about 500 trucks per day. We've not even been hitting 100 trucks per day in the last month. So what the international community is saying, many are saying that Gaza already is at a state of famine. Even our own head of USAID, Samantha Power, has said famine has begun. But the statistics as of a few weeks ago is that more than 450,000 people are already at the most acute level of hunger in Gaza. We have seen at least 20 plus deaths of people who've died specifically of hunger. And that's not counting deaths that are related, or children who will be permanently affected because of malnutrition. So we can talk more certainly about the humanitarian issue. The challenge is the Israeli policy has been no humanitarian assistance until all of the hostages are released. That has shifted a bit, but not much. There's still a significant challenge of getting adequate humanitarian assistance into Gaza. It is illegal by international humanitarian law to limit medical supplies, to limit food, to limit water. It is illegal by international humanitarian law. And yet that is a battle we are still fighting. So our second call has been for immediate and adequate humanitarian assistance. The third call has been for the release of hostages. And so we've been very much in solidarity with our Jewish friends since the very first day, calling for the release of hostages from Gaza. I mentioned already 240 were taken on October 7th. A number have been released already, and it's believed that 100 or more still are in Gaza, but it's not known how many are dead or are alive. And every day that the atrocities continue, the hostages' lives are at risk. And so there are protests all over Israel right now calling for negotiations and a permanent ceasefire, and calling for the release of hostages. We're also calling for Palestinian prisoners that are held without due process, that are held unjustly, to be released. There is something in Israel called administrative detentions, where Palestinians who live under the occupied Palestinian territories, they can be held without any charges, they can be held without any court case. So there's a woman, a young Palestinian Christian woman whose name is Leon Nasser. I don't know if you've heard of her. She's been serving for 4 months in Israeli military prison. She just had a court hearing in the last week under administrative detention. No charges, no court case. And that hearing, we were hoping that she would be released, and she was not. Palestinians can be held for up to 10 years under administrative detention, and after 10 years, the 10 years can be renewed. In addition to that, we're calling that the core issues of the conflict be addressed. Palestinians and Israelis cannot continue to have these cycles of violence. We thought that the 2014 war, we thought it was the worst war that we'd seen. 500 children were killed in the summer of 2014. And I was with World Vision at the time. 500 children was such an atrocious number, we couldn't fathom it. The number of children killed in the last 9 months is more than 14,000 children. More than 14,000 children. And the United States is still sending weapons. The majority of weapons that are being used are the US weapons. So the final call that we have had is that the US would stop sending arms that are supporting the perpetration of what's happening in Gaza and what's happening. That this has to be brought to an end. And the US to stop sending arms. Well, we had one moment at the beginning of May where Biden said there was a red line, and the red line didn't last long. And so, there's been no reaction. I mean, we have meetings with them regularly. I mean, but what they say and what they do is completely not in alignment. Completely not in alignment. I mean, I was in touch with them again this morning after this most recent incident. The death toll came in at 90. Mm-hmm. Yeah, please.
Oh, I can't say who it was with or the content, but we had a high-level meeting at the State Department with a group of think tanks and NGOs who do detailed analysis on weapon sales, and we were assured and kind of walked in detail through how everything is being appropriately followed within U.S. law. And they wouldn't, basically they said, well, like, this is what we're following our law, and these are the ways we're doing it. And we had a whole range of lawyers in the group and people who researched this extensively, and it was interesting to see the political decision being framed as a sort of technocratic, like, well, this is just like we're following what we need to do, doing appropriate measures.
And I'll just say two more things about that, and then we can transition formally into question and answer. There are two primary mechanisms by which weapons can be withheld almost immediately in terms of what's happening right now. One is the Presidential Security Memorandum 20, which was an executive, it's almost the equivalent of an executive order, but this Presidential Memorandum 20, they call it MS 20. NSM 20, I don't do acronyms. So you take the first letter of each word and tell me what the acronym is. But, and in that evaluation, it came back and the US acknowledged that there have been reported cases where weapons have been used, US weapons have been used that have not been in accordance with US law, which would allow for the withholding of weapons according to the application of our own US laws, not even international law, US law. And it still has not been enough. So that's one mechanism. Another mechanism has been the Leahy laws, which demand that that specific military units be held accountable if they are in violation. And units, 5 units in the Israeli military have been found by US government evaluations, have been found in violation of the Leahy laws. This is the first time the Leahy law has been applied to Israel, and it came back that they were, the reason that weapons were not withheld from those units was because these units self-corrected. So those are the responses that we've been having. So I'll just close by saying, thank you. So the last one was just that this cannot continue, that we have to address the core causes of this conflict, that a negotiated, permanent, lasting agreement has to be found, that the cycles of violence cannot continue. And if our strategy was initially a moral strategy, death and violence and destruction, the killing of civilians is illegal by international law, stop killing people because it's the right thing to do. And that argument didn't work. So then we went to, we'll go to the pragmatic strategy. The pragmatic strategy is, if you won't stop killing Palestinians because they're human, stop killing Palestinians because it's really bad for Israel. Anti-Semitism is on the rise globally. Israel is becoming a pariah state, and not only that, the US is becoming a pariah state, right alongside of Israel. So do it for the sake of pragmatics. Do it because there's really good reasons to stop. Every day, the bombing of Gaza continues is bad for Israel. So don't do it for Palestinians, do it for Israel. That's a pragmatic reason, right? That didn't work. So then we started the third strategy, which we call the persistent widow strategy. You know the story in the scriptures? The persistent widow goes before an unjust judge, and her cause is righteous. And the unjust judge sends her home. He does not give her justice. And the woman comes back every day and demands justice. And that's what we've been doing. Sometimes I write the White House every day. And we talk to the White House and we meet with the White House. And then we go to the State Department. And so we are now employing the persistent widow strategy and demanding that the killings stop. May it be so. In the name of Christ. Amen.
So I said I would say extra things, but I think we'll just go to questions. And I think it makes more sense to do that anyway. So we will restate the question unless there's an additional mic we can pass around. Since this is being both recorded and live streamed, it would be worthwhile to have that. We'll repeat back the basics, I guess, unless we should have to hand this out. So go this way. All right. I think you were first. We'll go this way. Trying to see everyone at once.
Given your experience and background knowledge, is there hope for the latest framework, for lack of a better word, that's out there that they're waiting to fill in the details? Any hope at all for it?
Okay. You want to do first?
So the question was, is there hope for the recent framework from our position and where we're sitting? So the recent framework is actually, Biden was the one that proposed it. It's a 3-phased framework. The first phase would allow for the release of the hostages that are the most vulnerable, those who are sick, the elderly, any remaining women. I think the number, I can't remember what the initial number proposed was, 50 maybe, but it's believed that maybe that's where the 33 number, the number that was proposed, they know that there are not that many alive, but that would be phase 1. And phase 1 initially would be 6 weeks. It would allow for phase 2 to be accomplished. And phase 2, the goal would be permanent ceasefire. Now, Hamas has been saying they would not agree to any ceasefire unless it's a permanent ceasefire. Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel has been saying he would not agree to any ceasefire unless Israel can finish their goals, which includes the eradication of Hamas, right? So Netanyahu has been saying he needs to be able to continue, that the Israeli army, they need to be able to continue fighting. And so that has been a little bit of where things have been stuck. Now, there also has been division within the Israeli government, and there have been divisions within the Hamas leadership as well. And so what you hear from one Hamas leader and what you hear, reported, et cetera, versus what you hear from Netanyahu, one of the Israeli leaders, I can't remember if it was the Israeli commander or the spokesperson for the IDF, they said Hamas is actually an ideology. They can't be defeated, right? So you have division between the IDF and Netanyahu happening. They're just in the last few days, 4 different countries were meeting in Doha. They just returned from that. There's another convening right now in Egypt. And so this is kind of hot off the press. Hamas said that they would lift the requirement that a permanent ceasefire be agreed to before they would agree to the plan, this 3-part plan. So the second part's that permanent peace, and then the third part is post-Gaza. After peace is accomplished, after there's a permanent ceasefire, the third part would be, the rebuilding phase, right? I'm sorry. Is there anything left in Gaza? Statistics are saying roughly 60% of the buildings are damaged or completely destroyed, is what statistics are saying. And I mean, we saw firsthand in North Gaza, we could see, because we were at the border and we had access to, what do they call those things? The binocular type thing. We could see, I mean, it's utter decimation, utter decimation. So is there any hope for that? We are people of faith, so there is always hope, but there are a lot of obstacles in the way. Now, Netanyahu's government is very tenuous. It takes 4 people leaving Netanyahu's government for it to fall. 2 have already left. And the most extreme are Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And they have said they don't want any type of peace agreement. And so Netanyahu is a bit stuck, because if he agrees to a negotiated settlement, they may or may not leave. And then the Orthodox were just conscripted into the military. And so there's been a question of whether or not the Orthodox would leave. So there's been a lot of dynamics, not only in Israel, with all of the other actors at the table as well.
How has the shifting public sentiment around what's going on there affected talks with U.S. State Department or the administration, between the public resignations and the protests and all that? Or has it affected it?
How has it affected the conversations with the U.S. government? That's a great question. The U.S. government is incredibly, do you want to take this? Do you want to go? Yeah, go ahead.
I would say it's hard to say. There's quite a lot of people that we would both officially talk to and talk to on the side who are officials, but not the top decision makers, who would be both personally as well as kind of public pressure affected. Whether or not that's enough to make a big change, it's, I would say, hard to say. I think to May's a few points, like the conversation has shifted somewhat gradually. So I'd say that's an impact. Whether or not it's enough to make a major change certainly hasn't quickly enough, in our opinion. But yeah, I think it's impacting, but it's pretty slow.
I have a question, and I'll just preface it briefly, on the question of getting a longer-term peace through development perspective. My name's Tim Rush. I'm with the Schiller Institute, came down from Leesburg. My colleague Bob Baker's here. And we've proposed now for more than 50 years something we call the OASIS Plan. And the idea is that any enduring peace has to be founded on economic benefits of such overwhelming nature for both Israelis, Palestinians, and the surrounding areas, that these cycles of violence can be overcome. And the husband of the founder of the Schiller Institute, Lyndon LaRouche, had proposed this back in 1975 after meeting with some Arabs and Israelis. Abba Eban was interested in it and others, and Henry Kissinger didn't like it and put his foot on it. It resurged and was embedded in the Oslo Accords of 1993. The annexes put a very strong plank on economic development, but that the World Bank and others did not want to see that proceed, and that was choked off, and obviously the assassination of Rabin brought that to an end. So we've put together, and we'll be delighted to share with you, anybody who would be interested afterwards, a video about 15 minutes that outlines it. But basically, it's building water conveyances with desalination of a very, very large scale, the equivalent of 2 to 3 new Jordan rivers that would be involving Gaza, involving Israel, involving the West Bank, and so forth. And then building various kinds of infrastructure around that, including transport, as a real hub for the whole region. And the reason I stress this is that our sense is that you can proceed, you could try to get some political agreements and then add this. But if you have this as a focus that really concentrates people's determination integral to the discussions of the various steps toward obviously ending the genocide, but moving in ways that benefit everybody, then you're going to have a climate in which other factors such as the development of the Belt and Road, the BRICS, there are all kinds of things that are in the air. Egypt, Iran, UAE would have joined the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa group. There can be flows of funds in here that would lift the whole platform of cooperation into a totally different realm. And we're just heart and soul fighting for this. Anybody, I don't want to take more time now because there are other questions, but anybody afterwards who would want to get some more information on this, we would welcome it. I should also say that in the 1950s and 60s, the United States played a very prominent and laudable role in exactly this kind of thinking that's not known today, but there in fact were advanced programs to build desalination plants, nuclear fired or otherwise, to get this kind of desalinated water of these volumes, underwriting, basically water for peace. That we need to revive that and get knowledge of it and just bring in as much as we can in every forum like this, a perspective so that people have a sense of what has to be discussed, put on the table now, so that all the other issues, which otherwise can be so overwhelming, on how are you going to divide up the land ownership in the West Bank, et cetera. It's such a tangle, but we can rise above it in a Treaty of Westphalia
Thank you.
approach.
Yes. I mean, I think the issue, this is the most well-studied conflict of our time. It's not that there are not solutions to the questions at hand. There are numerous solutions. There could be a one-state solution, a two-state solution, a federated solution. There could be a 10-state solution. I mean, there are detailed plans that could help solve these problems. I mean, the economic components that you just spoke of in terms of a development-centered solution was essentially one of the foundational principles of the Kerry Peace Plan under President Obama. I mean, and that was based in large part on the Arab Peace Initiative, which said Israel can be the very center of Middle East economy if it wants to be, where all of the Muslim nations would acknowledge Israel's right to exist, would normalize, the whole center of the Abraham Accords, under President Trump was based on this idea of the economic benefit to Israel of making peace. And so I think the issue is not that there are not solutions. There has not been political will. And there's not, from the vantage point we're sitting at, there's not political will anywhere. There's not political will amongst the Palestinians. There's not political will amongst the Israelis. There's not political will in Washington, D.C. And so one of the things we have been hearing that is so frustrating is the U.S., the U.S. plays the role of being a mediator and is completely not neutral in any way, shape, or form. And so The large concern right now are the escalations at the northern border of Israel and the southern border with Lebanon between Hezbollah and Israel, where we very well could be on the precipice of a broader Middle East war, which if things escalate to that degree, and I'm not trying to be alarmist, but it is not that far off. But if there becomes a broader regional war, it very easily could become a global war, because Russia and China are very interested in engaging in the Middle East, and they support the countries that the US doesn't support. And so you have this, and the US's whole strategy has been deterrence. And so they keep saying, we're going to send more and more arms because that's going to deter things from escalating. And here we are 9 months later, and the exact opposite. I mean, we've been saying to them, by the way, for 9 months, hello, you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? And so that's part of the reality that we're seeing happen on the ground.
Like your third strategy, just persistence. I used to live in Oakland, California, and lived kind of in the inner city. And I had a roommate who got really upset that we didn't have recycling bins. And it was just like, he just wouldn't let it go. And so he called every single day for, I think it was like 7 months, for them to get us recycling bins. And 7 months later, I mean, what's that, 200 phone calls later, we got the recycling bins. Not the same stakes.
But I still like the story.
Yeah, we got those recycling bins. So that's what your story or your third strategy reminded me of. The other way of, instead of just waiting 7 months, maybe we could have gotten 200 people to call in one day, right?
Yeah.
So are there thoughts around sort of organizing so that, the church body that is represented here and by the Church of the Brethren, by other churches for Middle East peace, can
thank you.
Because I think a lot of times people want to do something, and they just like don't know how. Like, help me to press the button so that the email gets sent to my senator, right? This is the first issue I've ever, other than like in a college class, where I've ever written a congressperson, right? This is like, it's so important. So how do we, what efforts are already in place? How do we help? What can we do next?
I love the question. And I have to say, I wish it were not true. The efforts are dimming. They're not getting stronger. We did something during Advent where, do you know how you have Advent calendars, chocolate or, whatever it is you do for Advent? We did prayer chains where we had churches have prayer chains where everybody could make a chain and take one home, but call your member of Congress every day and ask them for 3 things: immediate and adequate humanitarian assistance, a permanent ceasefire, and immediate and adequate, I'm repeating myself, thank you, and the release of hostages, and prisoners held unjustly. Those 3 things, like that was it every day. And we have a button on our website where you can click the button and your phone will automatically go, when you put in your zip code, to all 3. So all you do is stay on the line and you get to talk to all 3, your representative and your 2 senators. Done. We pay 17 cents and you get, and it's done. So we have those mechanisms, and we'd love to encourage you to continue to do so. And we're hearing on Capitol Hill that the calls are not coming. The calls are not coming. The other thing we're hearing is that calls are not coming from Christians. And so we're saying, it might sound silly to say, hi, I'm a Christian. I support a ceasefire, but the White House has been like, Christians don't support ceasefires. And we're like, what are you talking about? Like, we've been, meeting with you constantly. Like, we're, and we represent millions of American Christians who've been calling for peace, right? So Another initiative that we started it in January. It went through Lent. We're now in phase 2. It's called Gaza Ceasefire Pilgrimages. There's a website, Gaza Ceasefire Pilgrimages. The idea was to walk in solidarity the distance that people from Gaza City to Rafah walked, 25 miles. A prayer walk, to do it as a spiritual discipline, to do it throughout Lent. We had groups that did it 1 mile a day during Lent. We had groups that did it 5 miles every Saturday. We had groups that did it 25 miles in one day. But to walk, to pray, to use it to call awareness, but also to use it to do activism. We thought if we got 5 cities, 5 pilgrimages, we'd be thrilled. All 7 continents, 20 countries around the world, and thousands of Gaza ceasefire pilgrimages happened. And now we're in phase 2, and we're saying, walk to people in power. Organize, especially in August. I don't know where your district office is. I'm like, what state am I in, and where are we, and where are your district offices? Thank you. We're in Virginia. I don't know where your district offices are, but, it might be too long to walk from the church, but, your representatives, August is when they go home to their home offices, right? So August is a great time. Do a pilgrimage, walk to the office. It's a way to do embodied prayer. We're calling for peace. We support all the people in the Holy Land. We call it Gaza Ceasefire Pilgrimages, right? And then we have a hashtag, and then it's one of the only things that got me through the first 6 months of the year. And one solo man did it in the bush in Australia. The way we got Antarctica was there was a man in the military who did 25 miles on a treadmill because it was too cold to do it outside. And it was really beautiful, raising awareness about what's happening, right? So those are ways that you can engage. We have a few events coming up. July 21st, we're calling it Solidarity Sunday. We're asking that churches would consider, at a minimum, some churches are so afraid to talk about this at all. We're like, if you're afraid to talk about this, on that Sunday, pray for peace in the Middle East. Not too controversial, I hope. You believe it or not, in some churches, that's a big deal. But okay. If you can say Gaza, if you can say Israel, if you can say occupied Palestinian territories, even better, right? So we have 4 different options for Solidarity Sunday: standing with solidarity with Christians, preventing genocide in Gaza. By the way, our policy positions, all 30 plus of our denominations have to agree on all of our language. So we all agreed we're committed to preventing genocide. Some of our churches are very clear it's genocide. Others feel uncomfortable with that language, but we're all committed to preventing it. So that's as strong as we get. I know other churches are using stronger language, but I just was explaining. So the 21st, it also, I don't know if you use lectionaries, but the lectionary passage that day is feeding the 5,000. It could preach on this issue. For Orthodox and Catholic churches, it's Saint Elias is feast day that weekend. He was a saint from Egypt who went to Jerusalem and responded to the needs of those who were starving. We didn't even plan that. I was like, and does anybody know why we would have a Solidarity Sunday on that day? What's happening on the 24th of July in Washington, D.C.? Prime Minister Netanyahu is speaking before the joint sessions of Congress on Wednesday, July 24th. So we're doing a prayer service. We will do a live vigil on the afternoon of the 21st, but on the 24th in Washington, D.C. that morning, we'll do a prayer service the day that Netanyahu is speaking on Capitol Hill as well. So those are just some of the ways. My final comment in terms of, I'm sorry. 9 a.m. It is scheduled to be at the United Methodist Building, but we actually think there might be too many people. So if you go to our website, it's all there, or if you did sign up, we have a weekly bulletin that'll have all the information about that for the 24th. The last thing I'll say is we've been calling people to stand in the gap, give, act, and pray. And so we invite people to consider becoming monthly donors, to consider supporting organizations like ours that are doing this work. People are saying, many people are saying, we want to give money to support humanitarian assistance into Gaza, which is phenomenal, but it's not getting into Gaza. And organizations like ours are working to help it get into Gaza, right? And actions, I just talked about some of the actions you can take. But then we have gatherings every week. So we pray together every Wednesday. We have a prayer meeting. Every Thursday, I give a live briefing. So every day I do a video, but every Thursday we summarize the news of what's happened in the last week to try to keep people informed about what's happening. And I think the last opportunity is we have partnerships with churches. And so we invite churches to become church partners, where we have studies that you can do to, if you want to study theology and how it impacts engagement in the land, or if you want to study the geopolitics and the history, we have all kinds of resources like that. And so we invite churches and organizations to consider partnering with us as well. That was a long answer, but.
For Solidarity Sunday, are there resources on the website that, to do like a bulletin insert or to have worship resources for that day?
There are like 4 different entire services, and there's plug and play. So we actually have videos from Palestinian Christians that are as short as 1 minute or 4 minutes that could be used in the service. And those are free or for a donation. I mean, it's not required. And all you do is go to the website and just fill out your church information. And then it's a Google folder where you can just download the resources. And they are across the spectrum in terms of Orthodox, Catholic, mainline Protestant, our peace churches, in terms of the types of prayers and resources that are available.
I wondered if you've been in touch with the Marwan Barghouthi family, because I think justly he's been called the Mandela of the Palestinians, and has a history at the time of the Oslo Accords of working closely with the Rabin group in Israel. And therefore there's a history that's above some of the internal divisions on the Palestinian side. And also how much you've been able to work with Reverend Munter Isaac, who obviously his Christmas message was heard very, very loudly. And he came to the States, I think, just a month and a half ago. I don't know if you had a chance to cross paths with him,
Sure.
or as part of your group. But I
Yes.
think those are 2 very notable elements that
Yes.
people can look to get a framework that gets out of, you're with Hamas, you're with, Smotrich or something. But,
Right. So Reverend Munter Isaac is a Lutheran pastor from Bethlehem. He's a dear friend. We sponsored the Christmas service. We did a service with him for Easter as well. We also hosted him and took him to the White House in November before Christmas. We hosted him when he was here just a couple of months ago. So we work very closely with Munter. So yes, is the answer to that question. And then Marwan Barghouthi, if you are not familiar with his story, there is a full-length documentary about his life that's available on Apple Plus. I don't know the name of it, but if you type in Barghouthi, it would tell you the name of it. But that just came out recently. He has been imprisoned for life. He was a part of the Palestinian Authority during the Second Intifada. And, I just in January was meeting with his wife and his family. We know his son, Arab. And so we're well familiar with his story. There are more than 100 countries around the world calling for his release. He is now one of the loudest voices calling for nonviolent active resistance in terms of the Palestinian struggle to end the occupation. And so I'd encourage you to watch that documentary. I guess my last word, I feel like this is that you have a role to play. Even if it is just when you have a sip of water, to remember those who right now don't have water, and to say a prayer for peace in Gaza and Israel and Palestine. Or when you are feeling like, I don't know what to do, you can go to our website and click that action button and call your members of Congress and say, I support efforts for peace and a comprehensive ceasefire and the release of hostages, right? That I believe regardless of where each of us are coming from, we all can do something, and we can be the persistent widow together as you described. So that's my hope and my prayer. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I think there are a few housekeeping things, and if it's appropriate, I'd really like to close our time in prayer together, but this sign-up sheet was passed around, and I think many of you saw it and were able to sign it, but if you did not, we'll go ahead and put it on the table in the narthex, and so you can sign it on your way out. Also in the narthex are some books that you might want to check out as well, and just feel free to stay and hold space for all that you're trying to absorb in this moment of all that we've learned in this last hour. I really appreciate you all taking time on a Saturday evening to be a part of this important conversation. Let's close our time in prayer together. Gracious God, we give thanks for this time and space where we've been able to come together to learn and to hold space for all that is happening in our world. Today, God, we just pray especially for our siblings who are in Israel and Palestine and in places of injustice and violence. God, we just pray that you would break our hearts for the things that break the heart of God. And when it feels overwhelming, God, we pray that you would expand our hearts and make it bigger so we can really stand in the gap and give where we're able, act when we can, and in all moments pray without ceasing. For it's in your holy name we pray. Amen. Thank you.